gee,
Oh, so active.
Well, hello out there on the internet, and welcome back to In Response, a Magic the Gathering channel focused on the rules and interactions of this game that we love. My name is TS, and in this episode, I'd like to talk to you about abilities. See, inside the text box of Magic the Gathering cards, there could be a number of different things written. Most of the time, it's going to add character to what that card is in the narrative of the game without actually changing the mechanics. It could be a quote from the lore or the history of where that character comes from. It could be something referencing the art on the card itself. In the recent events of Universe Beyond cards being added to Magic the Gathering, it usually references something from the original source material for that card. But in those cases, that text only adds character and narrative, not necessarily changing how the game is played. What we're going to look at today is ability text that could come in the form of a static ability that's simply a statement of something that card makes true while it's in play. It could be an activated ability, which is something that you have to specifically take an action to make happen. It could be a triggered ability, something that waits for some other game event before it does what it wants to do. It could be a replacement effect that it itself doesn't do anything, but it modifies something else that's trying to happen. It could be a characteristic defining ability, something that's always true, even if it's not in play. Or it could be one of the many keywords that have been introduced in the Magic the Gathering history over the years. We're going to take a look at these abilities and just define what they are today, though we're not necessarily going to go into a deep dive on those abilities. I just want you to have a solid foundation so that when this comes up on later episodes as we talk about more specific scenarios, you'll have a better understanding of how they interact. So let's start with static abilities. A static ability, simply enough, is a statement. It's not waiting for something to happen. It's not an active choice to make it start to happen. It's not replacing another event. It's simply a statement. The most basic example can be found on Glorious Anthem. Glorious Anthem simply says that all of your creatures get a +1/+1 bonus. This means that while Glorious Anthem is in play, all of your creatures get +1 to their power and +1 to their toughness. That's it. Another example of static ability can be found on Song of the Dryads. Song of the Dryads is an enchantment aura that you put onto a permanent in play. And it simply says that permanent is now a forest. Now, that may seem situational because it only applies to the one thing, but it is still a static ability. As long as that aura is on that permanent, it is a forest. That's it. Now, the third example I'd like to use can seem a little more complex on the surface, so let's break it down. Bellow, Bard of the Brambles, has an ability that states that during your turn, all of your non-equipment artifacts and non-aura enchantments with mana value 4 or greater are 4/4 elemental creatures. They have indestructible, haste, and an ability that when they deal combat damage, you draw a card. Now, on first reading of this ability, it may seem like it fits other definitions of different types of abilities, such as keywords or triggered abilities, because it's waiting for certain timing and it's using some of the words we'll talk about later that characterize a triggered ability or a keyword. But this simply makes a statement. During your turn, this is true. That's it. We'll get into more detail about the other parts a little bit later. So now let's take a look at activated abilities. Activated abilities are actually one of the easiest ones to spot and differentiate from any other type of ability. An activated ability is always going to be formatted the same way. It's going to start with a cost, there will be a colon, and then there will be the effect. Now that cost may look different for each activated ability. So it could be mana symbols, indicating you have to pay a specific type or amount of mana in order to activate it. It could take the form of a tap symbol, indicating that you need to be able to tap that object in order to activate the ability. And again, that cost could come in a number of other forms, such as sacrificing something, discarding something, but it will be very specific on what that cost is. Now, activating an ability works the exact same way as casting a spell, in that once you declare your intent to activate that ability, nobody else gets priority during that process. So while you're choosing targets, while you're activating mana abilities, while you are making any other decision that needs to be made, until you are done with that process, nobody else can take an action. Once you've paid the cost, made all your decisions, and taken all the steps of activating that ability, it goes onto the stack and can now be responded to. The big difference between an activated ability and a spell is that you are not putting a card onto the stack. You're not putting a physical object there, but there's an imaginary placeholder that we use on the stack. So back in episode 6, we talked a little bit about triggered abilities and how they interact with the stack. That is not going to be the last time we talk about triggered abilities, so I want to make sure that we know what a triggered ability is, how to identify it. A triggered ability is always going to start with either the word when, whenever, or at. So for example, when this creature enters the battlefield, whenever you draw a card, at the beginning of your upkeep. This is telling you what the triggering event is that causes this ability to go onto the stack, and then everything that follows is what will happen when that ability resolves. Now, of all of the ability types that we've talked about or are going to talk about, the two that get confused most often, whether it's a new player or an experienced player, is a triggered ability and a replacement effect. They both behave in many similar ways, but there are some key differences. Think of it as past, present, and future. An activated ability is the present. You are taking an action right now. A triggered ability is the past. Because something happened first, this is happening now. A replacement effect is the future. It sees something that is going to happen, and right before it happens, the replacement effect changes what's actually going to happen. So for example, if you have an anointed procession in play, and you're about to make a token, it doesn't wait for the token to be made. It modifies as the token is being made how many that token creation event is making. Or, if you have a fiery emancipation in play, it looks at the damage you are about to deal and changes the amount of damage that actually is, not afterwards. Or, if you have a ley line of the void in play, it changes where your opponent's cards go right before they would go to the graveyard, so they never actually go there. This is where it's very different from a triggered ability. Replacement effects don't wait for something to happen first. They change what is going to happen. Now, similar to how replacement effects and triggered abilities are often confused with one another, characteristic defining abilities, or CDA for short, are often confused with static abilities. The main difference is that a static ability is only effective while it's in play on the battlefield. A CDA is active and affecting that card in every conceivable zone, whether that's in play, in your hand, in your library, in your graveyard, in your exile, or even for some formats that have a sideboard, in your sideboard. That CDA is modifying that card in some meaningful way. A characteristic defining ability, just like it says, is going to give a characteristic to that card that is not already printed on there. So it might change the creature types that card has. It might affect the power and toughness values of that card. It might even affect the color of that card. In some way, that characteristic defining ability is going to tell you information about that card that was not already printed on it in every possible zone. The next type of ability I want to discuss here is called a keyword ability. A keyword ability is either a single word or a short phrase that shows up on a card that doesn't necessarily spell out the entire ability on that card. These are abilities that have either already shown up on so many cards, or the designers knew will show up on so many cards, that rather than print them individually on each separate card, they simply gave that entire ability a keyword that they can simplify and put on the card with that single word or phrase, and players will eventually understand what that keyword is just by seeing that word. There are some abilities that didn't originally have keywords, such as Hexproof or Mill, but eventually gained these keywords because they were simply put on so many cards. So what we're going to do is, in the next couple videos, we're going to go over some common keywords that are used and give a brief explanation of what each of those are. I don't think we're going to be able to go over every single one, at least not all in one stretch, but there are some that will come up in later videos, and we will go through and explain those as they show up. So until then, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
You may have heard the phrase "reading the card explains the card" before, a pretty common phrase in the Magic community, especially...
Do you not know what this card does? Well, reading the card explains the card.
It's written right there, clear as day. And as the saying goes,
Reading the card explains the card.
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 There's nothing more annoying on this God's green earth than when someone looks you dead in the eyes and goes, reading the card explains the card. Ooh.